Hello, everyone. Welcome to the introduction panel of our Dünyalar program. And thank you very much for being with us on this hot day in front of your screens. Dünyalar program will encourage and enhance community-based solutions for climate change issues. And we have Sivil Düşün program supported by Center for Spatial Justice in the scope of this program. In this panel, we are going to discuss climate change from the perspective of justice. We are going to talk about the communities' place and role in combating climate change. And we are also going to discuss the different sides of climate change and what type of possible solutions there can be regarding overcoming these differences. And we are going to have 4 panelists, one of whom is going to join us online. So let me introduce them. First, we have Professor Dr. Doğanay Tolunay, Istanbul University Cerrahpaşa Forestry Faculty, Academician. We have Dr. Özlem Aslan from Kadir Has University. Professor Dr. Murat Türkeş from Boğaziçi University Climate Change and Policies Research Center, and social entrepreneur Şahadet Çitil. Thank you very much, everyone, for being with us. And we have 15 minutes for each panelist. And after the first round of 15 minutes, maybe we are going to have a couple of rounds of other fast contributions if we have anything else left in mind. We have a Q&A part as well after the first round. And Doğanay, let us start with you. Especially, let us, of course, we have discussed climate change based on the forest fires in the Western Mediterranean, and climate change seems to be a phase in this geography. In the Western Mediterranean, the forests is the most visible impacts in terms of climate change, but we will also let us also discuss what are the action areas and what is the community's role in this issue, and also the local governments and decision makers, how can they collaborate with the communities? Thank you very much. First of all, Sivil Düşün program, I would like to congratulate you for organizing such programs, because the combating climate change actions should start with the local level. It should start from the grassroots. And it is not correct to expect everything from the decision makers. The grassroots are also important, the communities, the associations, and with the, of course, pressure put upon the decision makers from the local communities is, of course, very important. But especially, yes, as you also mentioned, the Western Mediterranean, the Aegean region, is one of the most visible regions in terms of climate change effects. In Muğla and Antalya, we have experienced forest fires, but what happens here is not only limited with forest fires. We also think of the Black Sea region. We all have floods, but in terms of floods in Antalya and Muğla, we even have a higher number of floods. Maybe, of course, we will have less disastrous impacts, but we talk about forest fires as well. You talked about Konda survey. And if we ask the question, what is the most frequent disaster we experience in Turkey? If that was a question, 90% of the population would say floods. I don't know if there's anybody else who thinks some others, but according to official numbers, it's storm. We do not believe that storms are very in the forefront. We talk about fires, we talk about floods, but between 1990 to the year 2000, more than 200 people died due to due to storms. And if we think about the forest fires, we can also think of other disasters that we do not discuss most frequently. One of them is drought. If we think of the statistics in terms of disasters, AFAD is also keeping the statistics and maybe TÜKSTAT. However, drought is difficult to measure, because when we talk about drought, what type of economic disasters or economic losses we see is limited. Of course, in terms of flood, in terms of fires, we can measure the economic loss that is experienced. However, in terms of storms, in terms of twisters, in terms of the floods, we cannot measure them usually. We think of Konya and the central Anatolia region, but also eastern Anatolia and western Mediterranean regions in terms of the drought. One of the most important reasons for fires last year is because of high level of drought in Muğla and Antalya. In the Black Sea region, we do not, of course, talk about the drought. We do not talk about dryness. We do not talk about fires, but we talk about landslides and floods. But due to extreme temperatures, in the upcoming future, we are going to see increase in high level of precipitation and floods in the Black Sea region. Yes, but in terms of disasters in Turkey, the regions in the forefront are the Mediterranean regions. We talk about the landslides and floods, but in the Aegean and Mediterranean regions, we see numerous different disasters: fires, hail, storms, twisters. We see different type of disasters. The number of total disasters, according to meteorology and AFAD numbers, the highest number of experienced disasters are in the Mediterranean region, Muğla and Antalya. After seeing this overall picture, we should look into the future, of course, what is expecting us. And the frequency and severity of these extreme weathers will increase. And of course, we should think of the issue, which is climate change. We are understanding it much better now. Yes, we have climate change understanding now and awareness is raised, but let's think of a disaster example, but climate change is seen as a scapegoat. They are probably thinking that for years, for centuries, we have been experiencing fires and floods. This is not linked with climate change, they must think. But climate is changing, and when we look at the intervals of 25 years or 30 years, we see that in longer intervals, these are changing. But on the other hand, independently from climate change, human hand errors are also being made. For example, building houses on riverbeds If you construct on a riverbed, you will experience the disasters from climate change. Or if you drill holes, you are going to, and wells, you will see the impacts of climate change after drought. So these are multiplier effects. We cannot only blame climate change. We cannot only blame human error. Both of them contribute to each other, and they will have multiplier effect. And for solution of this, you need to be aware of this multiplier impact. And of course, we do not have a magic wand at hand. And if we stop using, let's say there's been a miracle and the world made a decision that we are not going to use fossil fuels anymore. Even if that happens, climate will continue to change. Maybe the increase in temperature rises will drop. Maybe we will go back to pre-industrial revolution era, but it is not going to be a return to level 0. Of course, we will combat climate change, but that possible impacts we can expect from climate change. How can we make the communities more resilient should be the issue we have to focus on, and we should include other living beings in the combat areas. Of course, we talked about the multiplier effect. We can mitigate the results of climate change and adapt to the climate change. Adaptation requires human error corrections, of course, not building on riverbeds, not over-exhausting or consuming the groundwaters, extreme growth in the urban areas. We are going to have to correct these actions. This is also among the action areas, and specifically for Turkey, it could be a concerning issue that these impacts will continue. This is also supported by official records of the government, of course. The Meteorology Department also is stating that this will continue. But of course, this should not create a setback. The communities should not think whatever we will do, this will continue. We still have some remedies at hand. As the world, as Turkey, we have action plans. The ministries have action plans, and already we know what to do, but we are acting a bit slow in terms of putting them into practice. So let me create a link with the community. After we have this general picture, we have seen both in terms of mitigation and adaptation that not us, but also the decision makers do not have a very long-term point of view. The politicians have 5-year perspectives because this is election periods, but climate change covers longer periods. That is why the top items on the agenda of politicians, climate change could not appear, because the priority, so in this sense, the priority task falls on the grassroots organizations. So if we have a picture of the community, I think there are a lot of associations that have been organized. So the number increased to 150,000 registered associations. But of course, it's almost 200,000. But when we look at the distribution of the associations and organizations, we see that the number of environmental organizations are limited. And a majority of them, well, unfortunately, Murat, please don't be offended, but some of them are not directly related to climate problems or environmental issues. And the existing associations have an issue that mostly their scope is very narrow, and they do not have a big capacity. So they cannot scale up, or they cannot roll out their beliefs and put a pressure on the decision makers. Their capacity is not at that level yet. So how to enhance the capacity of the civil society should be our topic, independent from climate change actions, because we have a lot of small-scale associations. So one of the aims of this project is to work on their platforms. Since there are small-scale associations, we can maybe gather them around a common objective. We will discuss whether it would be possible. And these small associations, one of the problems that it brings is that if you are working with a community, if you are going to work with a theme of climate change, you need scientific information. What is the result? What is the source of this? Of course, you might need to develop your own ideas, or you can exchange opinions with associations from abroad. So one of the ways is to gather scientists and organizations to exchange opinions. And there's another way, which is in some civil society organizations, the colleagues who are working in the associations develop themselves. They read more, they exchange opinions with the scientists. And this is another way, of course. And there are different models. And you said you had a lot of hats. One of your hats is Center for Spatial Justice. I have a lot of hats as well. And 90% of my time is spent with voluntarism and voluntary actions. There are, of course, a lot of different models, and some of them are based on producing scientific data, evidencing what you are working on, and creating professional teams. Some volunteers work through them, and some voluntary organizations actively work with scientific boards. And although there is an example of this, which is a professional organization, but TEMA could be an also example. This is not a profit-oriented professionalism, of course, but in order for an association to run itself, we need some inputs. But to wrap up, definitely the communities, they could be association, foundation, or a platform. Somehow, if they are not supported with science, they cannot produce much. When we talk about being supported by science, of course, the scientists could volunteer in these associations, but sometimes it is not possible. What is important is the communities to enhance their scientific background and scientific activities. And so the communities should be supported by the public. Thank you.
It's good that you're talking about adaptation, and in Turkey and also in the world, the activists sometimes were not very willing to take actions in this respect because they didn't think that we could have abatement in the longer term and do much about this. So when it comes to adaptation, raising our voices and doing something active was seen as ineffective, but now climate change is a part of our life. So we should also talk about justice in this respect. So different groups are affected by different problems. Now I would like to go to Özlem. So how can we discuss climate change and justice together? So from a rights-based angle, how can they discuss climate change and how they can adapt it to their own activities. And generally, what is climate justice in the perspective of climate change? How can we make it operational? Let's start with you. First of all, thank you. And I'd like to thank our audience, first of all, and also the members of Center for Spatial Justice and Civilization. I would like to thank you for organizing this event. So when it comes to climate justice, actually, I would like to discuss this based on two concepts, which is vulnerability and resilience. So when we say resilience, what do we mean? So there's a socio-ecological system, and to what extent can it create an impact? So there's a social and ecological system. After this impact, to what extent can it restore itself? And before it comes across this impact, there was a situation that it would be able to do this. Can it do it later on and restore itself later on? And also we're talking about taking precautions. And maybe the first requirement for ensuring resilience is to confront the risk and looking for ways to cope with this. There are two different types of resilience here. The first one is the social resilience or the resilience of communities, and the other one is the spatial resilience or location resilience. These two concepts are related to one another, but we can also discuss them separately. So social resilience. So when we talk about this, as the one I also mentioned, there's the adaptation policies, and the local information should also be included in those policies. So at local level, there are already existing social networks, and they should be more functional when it comes to developing policies in this respect. And it should be a self-sufficient system. We should strengthen local institutions. We should take lessons, draw lessons from the creative solutions or actions at local level. Or let's say there's drought in a geography, and what are the coping methods? Traditional methods could be researched, this information could be disseminated and shared with the other social groups. And when we talk about vulnerability, this social ecological system, to what extent is it vulnerable or sensitive to certain impacts? So first of all, of course, it's about the severity of the risk. So after the risk analysis, the adaptation capacity of the group when facing this risk is also important. Can these people go elsewhere, for instance? Or ecological, I think it's not working, microphone. So this climate-based ecological change, if it has impacts on livelihoods, can they have alternative livelihoods, for instance? I mean, the social groups, do they have such networks? And also the poor sections of the society, the migrants, the women, LGBTI, youth, and children are considered in vulnerable groups of people. And there are different methods followed in this respect in order to empower those groups, ensuring their access to credits and to make sure that they can use their budgets more correctly, etc. But the studies on the resilience and vulnerability of the society are very important. As you mentioned, people should feel that they can do something about this and they should be active. But there are also some limits and boundaries to this framework. We should also recognize this, because some communities, when it comes to income, disability, education level, gender, age, class, etc. So depending on these categories, they could be vulnerable groups in case of disasters. And when it comes to others, in terms of adapting to the results of the disaster and restoring their capacities after the disaster, etc., they may also be defined as resilient. But the social injustices and inequalities that are the reasons of this vulnerability may not be discussed sufficiently in this respect. So resilience and vulnerability, when we consider it only based on social groups, actually it's missing something, as the one I also mentioned. So we should consider the location or spatial resilience and vulnerability as well. So what am I talking about here? The environmental degradation, the urbanization. So what kind of an impact does it create on our vulnerability? For instance, fast and uncontrolled urbanization makes a lot of groups vulnerable in case of disasters. So both physical and social factors are considered in this respect. And what are we talking about when we say physical conditions? For instance, urban infrastructure, the roads, water, heating, electricity services, bridges, dams, airway transportation, rail transportation, disaster services, etc. All of them. So Ms. Doğanay said that we should not expect everything from the state or the government. Yes, it's correct, but also we should be able to create a social agenda so that they can work on this respect. So when we talk about such infrastructures, so in such crisis environments, the information services, etc., should circulate in an area. They should exist in an area. And we are talking about networks, and we are talking about establishing mechanisms to make this happen. So though I already mentioned, for instance, when we think from the perspective of Turkey in terms of the height of the buildings, the intensity of the buildings, there's an uncontrolled increase, and the green areas are now concrete areas, and agricultural areas are open to urbanization, and the river canals are considered in an unplanned manner. Therefore, another way to empower communities about climate change is to inform them about the services, to make sure that they demand those services, and when it's not provided, what are the legal mechanisms that they can be referred to. So there is the rights-based approach here, actually. And Article 56 of our Constitution, it's very famous, actually. We always refer to it in our articles. Everybody is entitled to live in a healthy and balanced environment, and protecting the environment and preventing the pollution is the duty of the state and the citizens. So it means that a location, spatial resilience and vulnerability policy should be introduced, and we should push the government to do so. So when we are discussing the vulnerability and resilience of the communities, we should not forget about the responsibility of the government, because at a point, of course, no matter how prepared the communities are in terms of disasters, actually it is the real impact created by the decision makers, to what extent those buildings and environments are sound. So instead of only focusing on the communities, infrastructure and geographical conditions should all be considered in this perspective. I think this is important. But in Turkey, when we look at the disaster policy, we discussed about this. There are the increasing temperatures at summer, surface water losses, the coast erosions, floods. They're all underlined, actually. They are all well known. However, disaster management and climate change are not hand in hand in the policies. And we already mentioned that abatement policies are, or mitigation policies are prioritized more, and adaptation is more in the background in the policies. So it's not very easy to have adaptation policies. Of course, you need a lot of financial resources in order to prepare the urban infrastructure well for such risks. Of course, it requires good financial means. But how do we spend our budget? How do we prioritize our budget are the questions that we should ask ourselves at this point. So we should also remember that in terms of adaptation, the low-income groups and their locations will be disregarded more. We can guess this because both in the floods and forest fires, we see who are mostly affected, as you can see. So creating a public opinion pressure in this respect will be very important for climate justice. So the disaster policy of the state in Turkey is focusing on the immediate incident and saving the situation. But after the disaster as well, we should have important considerations. We should shift this policy, and we should focus more on preparations before the disaster as well. And when we look at this community issue, there are neighborhood disaster volunteers in Turkey, and there's a natural disaster insurance institution. They have their awareness activities going on, but it's very difficult to say that they have a rights-based angle, actually. They are mostly raising awareness of those communities, people, but um, uh, those people are not having enough awareness in terms of claiming for their rights. So raising awareness of people in terms of their legal rights and to make them have an accountable position, actually, or asking someone to account for their actions. It's very important. And also there's a force majeure issue, which is used as an excuse mostly. This should be also discussed very well, because so most of the factors or incidents can be foreseen and prevented. They are mostly not force majeure, but because of lack of necessary measures, we are having those important losses. And actually, I'm surprised at the statistics that you shared. The Turkish society is very well aware of the situation. It's surprising, but there's something important that we should change in this community as well. So when it comes to disasters, etc., they have this fatalistic or determinist understanding, like it's from God and it's our fate. So there's such an understanding that we can observe. And when we are discussing with people, we can observe this. So changing this understanding is also very important. And state also has responsibilities about preparations before the disaster. We should remind this to people. And the should participate as well in terms of creating solutions, because it's about their own interests as well. The society may not be that innocent as well in urban projects, for instance. And also legal instruments should be more accessible. This is also important. So actually, what are we talking about here? So spaces in which we can live. I mean, we are to create such spaces, and we should have pressure on the state. So actually, this is the most basic thing about this crisis environment. How can we go on in life? And COVID-19 has shown us that when we have survival issues, gender equality issues are also increasing, because this care work, which is required in survival mode, is also mostly on the shoulders of women. Therefore, in terms of creating such spaces, we should mobilize the society, and we should release the burden of caregivers in this respect, and also establishing the infrastructures, providing technologies, and increasing social services is also important in this respect. So when we are trying to increase the resilience of the society and decrease their vulnerability, we should make sure that they participate in decision-making processes, and we should make their already existing networks more functional, and also those who are prioritizing life should be supported in their infrastructure as well. Thank you. I spoke very fast, sorry.
Thank you very much for using the time so efficiently. So the perspective that focuses on pre-disaster is very important, and you emphasize this. And to focus on combining approaches, which combine the daily life problems and climate change would be in the forefront. And probably the climate change concerns can diminish, and the decision makers can assume a more active role with this perspective and with this approach. And the households' access to food and water and accommodation are all being impacted by that. And let me now turn to Murat Türkeş. Professor Dr. Murat Türkeş is an academician who has been working on these issues, and based on water and food crisis, he's formalizing the activities, especially in Çukurova and in northern Aegean, the food and water crisis are maybe in the forefront, and we can start with the top three reasons discussing this issue. How can we work together in mitigating these problems, and how can we give reference to these geographies? Well, Professor Murat has been waiting in front of his screen for a long time, and we would like to specifically thank him for his patience. Thank you very much. I could not hear some of the words that you mentioned, but previously there were already prepared questions, so I already prepared my speech, so I apologize if I missed anything. I would like to thank Sivil Düşün and Center for Spatial Justice for organizing this panel, and thank you for giving me the floor as well. All panelists, I send my regards to you all from Çukurova from Çanakkale. Well, with Professor Doğanay, we are working with Bergama Kozak increasing yields projects in terms of pine cones. We have this project implemented in Izmir in collaboration with Izmir Metropolitan Municipality, and we are volunteering in this activity as well. Well, I have these questions, and the issue is Çukurova and Northern Aegean region. First, very generally, what is the climate and climate change dimension in these regions? We have been working on these activities together, and we have our own studies. First of all, in Çukurova and Northern Aegean, generally in terms of the climate, it's subtropical Mediterranean climate geography. And of course, it has various microclimatic areas inside, and depending on, of course, the environment, there is more peat areas and mountains areas, and their northern and southern differences are creating this area. Even though there is no climate change, Çukurova, which is a Eastern Mediterranean and Northern Aegean, and Biga is also very important in this area. So even if there is no climate change, there are two regions that we articulated that are going to experience some change, and they have their own specific climates. It is a long and dry summer period, and the differences between the precipitation in years changes significantly. Of course, these changes among the years and seasonality impacts are high. So as well as climate change, the natural climatic differences have been creating great effects on the communities, the agriculture, and evolving of the communities and agriculture and the environment here. And this is also changing, especially after the Industrial Revolution from the last quarter of the 20th century to our day. The impact has been significantly increasing. We are talking about a climate change. So especially in all climatic areas of the world where people live, climate change is hitting, of course. And a global increase in surface temperatures, decrease in icebergs, increase in sea levels, ecosystem and biodiversity to be impacted on this, decreased soil humidity, increased heat waves, and wherever there is precipitation, the extreme precipitation events also are the very visible results of climate change all around the world. Of course, different sectors, hydrology, water resources, drinking water, agricultural production, food production are all being impacted by this. In Çukurova and in Northern Aegean, when we look at the climate change issue, when we look at a Mediterranean region, we can think of it as a sub-region, both Çukurova and Northern Aegean are being impacted by climate change at the highest level. So by the end of the century, for example, in Çukurova and in Northern Aegean, especially if we consider spring and summer, only annual averages in terms of seasonal averages for spring and summer will also show us that by the end of the century, compared to date, there's going to be up to 7 centigrades degree of hot climate that will be experienced in the region. The big proportion of the Mediterranean basin, including Çukurova and Northern Aegean, we expect increases in extreme hot weathers, and the frequency and severity of drought will increase, and decrease in soil organic matter is expected, and especially the organic matter in the topsoil will have adverse effects on agriculture, and these are all expected for these regions. In the question, of course, we have the top 3 problems in terms of food crisis and water crisis. My top 3 topics are that we, of course, understand from what we are discussing that in the world and in Turkey, the climate is changing rapidly, both in Çukurova and in the Northern Aegean. Both in Çukurova and in the Northern Aegean, natural and human systems, socioeconomic systems and sectors are mostly adversely affected by climate change. Droughts and heat waves are experienced, and if there is precipitation, heavy rainfalls are and hail storms are expected in the urban and rural areas, and that will lead to floods, and also including the northern, the Black Sea region, eastern and western Black Sea region, and eastern Anatolia regions. The flood extremities will also impact people's lives. So these problems that we experience in these 2 regions, how can we increase the resistance or resilience of the people living in these regions? How can we decrease their possibility of being impacted? Because if you do not decrease the factors of effect, you cannot increase their resilience, or you cannot ensure adaptation. And through these means, the sustainability of the systems and enhancing adaptation capacities have not reached a certain level, and this is creating a big problem in terms of climate. Mostly there is data cooperation problem. In many areas in the world, there is very clear impacts on health, climate change and heat waves impact on health are being published, and in Turkey we're experiencing health impacts as well, especially from the atmosphere, from the Middle East and in Northern Africa. The dust storms are coming to Turkey, and air pollution and these dust pollution's impact on human health are not published. Especially these heat waves, climate change, and health effects are not published in international journals as well in terms of Turkey. And this lack of data, published data, is also a problem. And of course, the organic matter in soil, the biological diversity are being impacted, burning stubbles, desertification, forest fires, storms, twisters, heavy rainfall, the floods in urban areas. They are not understood well by the human systems, social systems, and natural systems, ecosystems, living areas, habitats, biodiversity, and their possibility of being impacted from climate change should be mitigated, and their long-term resilience should be enhanced, and we should have a successful adaptation action. And this is a problem all around Turkey and in the world as well. The second issue is about food. The impact of climate change on food is more visible with wrong agricultural policies, with different pricing policies each year, giving subsidies and supports that are different each year, insufficient or wrong subsidies and incentives, increase in agricultural inputs, increase in food prices, food security and safety being distorted, lack of access to safe water, safe food, and food security problem is experienced in Turkey, in Çukurova and northern Aegean regions, as it is the case in all around the world. Especially in terms of climate change, I want to define what resilience is. Resilience in terms of climate change is that human and natural systems to have resilience towards the changes in the climate systems and enhance their responsiveness for these changes. On one side, mitigating the impacts of climate change, and on the other hand, adaptation. So increasing resilience is going to close this conceptual gap between mitigation and adaptation. In terms of agricultural production, plant production, livestock production, in terms of forest areas, sustainable land management, sustainable forest management, these two are very important. And of course, resilience is a very comprehensive issue. This is the case for the regions you asked me, and in terms of being affected, of course, not the community is not homogeneous. So in this sense, when we keep the adaptation capacity and enhance adaptation capacity, it would be an important initiative. One of the main ways of enhancing community resilience is that in underdeveloped areas where we have in these regions, the women, the elderly and children's openness to the effects of climate change, to be responsive to what is coming, for example, heat waves, twisters, storms and droughts and floods, to be resistant towards these pressures. They are insufficient, and we need to enhance and further strengthen their responsiveness and their resilience. So when we are making these analyses in terms of enhancing resilience, socioeconomic and ecologic factors are being studied, and we need to improve these. In this sense, in terms of climate change, affectability should be defined in terms of risk analysis as well, because disaster management, disaster risk management is concepts and models and calculations that is worldwide accepted, that are worldwide expected calculations. So in terms of physical geography or socioeconomic sectors, affectability from climate change, or their openness to effect, or their responsiveness on this pressure, or on this tension, or the relationship between adaptability and being responsive to these issues. So if we stop using the word climate change but use climate, the climate affectability would be seen as high in the Mediterranean and northern Aegean regions. Water crisis, well, of course, the Black Sea region of the country is high, and mountainous areas and humidity. In terms of climate change, maybe Erzurum Kars region, apart from that region, Turkey's hydroclimatic factors do not show Turkey as a rich country. Of course, we are not a very dry African country, but 65% water gap is experienced annually. So there are regions that are arid, semi-arid, or humid, semi-humid areas. In Çukurova and northern region, some microclimatic areas have semi-arid areas, but we have humid and semi-humid areas as well. Both in Boğaziçi University climate change studies and global and regional activities and IPCC's global assessments show that in the Mediterranean region, in Çukurova and in northern Aegean, we see the severity and frequency of droughts will increase. And for example, Çukurova, Eastern Mediterranean, will be more arid compared to our day. So maybe if we had 50% arid or semi-arid areas currently, but in the upcoming, by the end of the century, maybe the entire area of Çukurova will become arid or semi-arid. In southern Marmara or in the northern Aegean, we are going to be facing more drought incidents. So in terms of climate change, an increasing speed of climate change will lead to drought and less groundwaters and water basins, watersheds not being able to be protected, forests, ecosystems, habitats to be distorted, especially in terms of mining activities and coal mining activities. The already insufficient and diminishing water and water crisis to become more adverse. So we can talk about these problems. What could the communities do in terms of these problems? Well, especially in terms of the northern Aegean, in Biga area, we are communicating with associations, with environmental platforms. We cooperate with the Chamber of Agricultural Engineers or engineers. We cooperate with them and we collaborate with them. We exchange opinions in terms of climate change, and most importantly, we are helping the establishment of new organizations. And we believe that it is important to form new organizations, and we believe that science should also guide them. So in enhancing collectivism, organization, and in Turkey, just as in many developing organizations. By the way, since it is included in my questions, Çukurova and Northern Aegean's most important topics are or can be listed as such, enhancing the organizational capacity. I don't want to, of course, repeat what I mentioned, but the related public bodies and ministries should have multi-sectoral collaboration approach, which focuses on geographical sciences. They unfortunately do not have institutional capacity yet in terms of increasing the sink capacities, in terms of enhancing resilience, disaster management, risk management, readiness towards disasters, climate change, effectiveness to be mitigated, to enhance sustainability and resilience. All of these, most of these issues are no longer in the jurisdiction of a couple of organizations or a couple of engineering professions. So institutional capacities should as soon as be enhanced in terms of enhancing adaptation capacities and mitigating the impacts of climate change, especially different sectors and different communities should handle the topics specifically to their areas.
Thank you. I think you can hear us. Yes, I can hear you. We can continue in the Q&A session. This resilience topic will be discussed further with Şahide and Çitil. So even if you do not name it like this, the activities that you carry out in the eastern and southeastern area of Turkey with the producers and women are aiming to increase resilience. or enabling this, or maybe aiming this. I don't know. You already have such activities. Therefore, we would like to hear you more. Tell us about the field. So we talked about climate change and discussing this in daily life as well, and hearing the voices of other people apart from the academicians will also be very good for us. I will mute this first and I will give you the microphone. Yes, actually, we are producers, agriculture producers. Therefore, we also partially have livestock production as well. So actually, we are not only observing climate change, we are also experiencing this. Like the professors mentioned, in the eastern and southeastern Anatolian area, the first thing that we experience is that we are not rich in water. We do not have any underground water, groundwater anymore, or creeks are also dry. What does it mean? Extreme rainfall, extreme heat, and lack of water is teaching us something new. And all the previous agricultural knowledge is now zero for us. So how does agriculture start? By seeding, right? In the past, for instance, in mid-November in Diyarbakir, for instance, you would plant the seeds for lentil and you wait for 10 or 15 days for rainfall, and then there's snow on it, and there's a more severe cold weather, and then the seeds would crackle towards spring, and there's rainfall, and with very little water or non-water actually you can produce lentil. But now it's no longer the case. There's no rainfall in November and December, and this year at the end of December and even in January only we could get rainfall in Diyarbakir. What does it mean? You need to irrigate, because this is an agricultural area and this is how people make a living. What does it mean to irrigate? Either you will abstract water on groundwater or from a creek. So what does it mean to abstract water from creek? It means that you will consume more energy, and eastern and southeastern Anatolian area region needs the energy most. So just because we cannot adapt to the climate and society, we need to consume more water and energy. How do we meet this energy from hydroelectric power plants, for instance? So what do the hydroelectric power plants do for us? They change the structure of the grass, and what does it make in the end? It makes animals hungry, and because animals are hungry, we are buying feed from abroad to feed them. So we lose water, soil, and also we need feed for animals as well. So there's also economic loss. So we should recognize that now climate change is not at the door, it's inside. And we are having one-on-one experience in this respect. And this is what we mean when we say we need to adapt. So whatever the soil and the air tells us, we need to do it. We can no longer plant seeds in November or October. So we need a new agricultural strategy and perspective. So we may need to change the seeding season, and also the dry farming or irrigated farming, or new agricultural activities that are compatible with the climate should be developed. In Karacadağ, for instance, in Diyarbakir, actually rice is cultivated without a drop of water requested, but it's no longer the case because there is no snowfall, and again we are abstracting groundwater and it consumes energy. So this year in the production of rice and lentil there is a decrease by half. So when we say food crisis, just only because of a practice that we cannot adapt correctly and change correctly, we are losing this. So in this cycle, for instance, we are talking about animals lastly. So animals are hungry, I said. I don't know if you know it, but in between Nusaybin, Cizre, and Silopi districts, people cultivate alfalfa. Yes, up until Cizre you can do it, but after Cizre you cannot do this because it's a mountainous area. Therefore, no agricultural activities could be carried out. It's mostly livestock production because there's Uludere, Hakkari, Çukurca in the upper parts where animal husbandry is mostly observed. And in order to feed the animals there, they cultivate alfalfa. And there's Nerfush Creek, and it was contaminated and polluted because of coal. And now the production of clover or alfalfa is also decreased. So the producers would like to use the areas in Adana, for instance, not to feed animals, but to cultivate, and they get or buy alfalfa from Silopi and Cizre, for instance, and there's also an interruption happening here. So we talk about bovine and ovine animals, but in Şemdinli, for instance, we have producers. It's one of the most specific examples. In Bitlis, Hizam, Pervari, Şemdinli, and Yüksekova, the best honey in the world is actually produced because it has endemic plants and these are high areas, but it's no longer the case. In Şemdinli, Çatalca, 2 weeks ago, our producer carried the beehives to Yüksekova because unexpectedly Çatalca is too hot. Therefore, he moved the beehives to Yüksekova so that the bees would be fed. But in Yüksekova, it's very, very cold. It's climate crisis, actually. It's not always extreme heat. Sometimes it's extreme cold, etc. And there's very sharp transition between the two. And between Yüksekova and Çatalca, there is a 40 to 50 kilometer difference. In terms of climate as well, there was no big difference. But in Çatalca, it's very hot. And in Yüksekova, it's too cold. And we are trying to convince the producer so that next year, he produces honey again. We are trying to convince him for this. Because there's a particular type of a plant which is milk thistle that the bees like, and it should also be present. And last year we were very affected by the bushfires, but in the same time period, Bingöl and Şemdinli was also too hot, and there were a lot of forest fires, and there was no response, and for weeks it continued. So in Bingöl and Şemdinli, there is animal husbandry. So the communities that are engaged in animal husbandry don't want afforestation because they want their animals to be fed by the grasses, actually. So this is not only about feeding animals. If we can ensure afforestation, we can change the climate. And if we can change the climate, we can develop and improve agricultural activities. And both animal husbandry and agriculture will take place. But unfortunately, afforestation cannot take place. Of course, the villagers, the communities, the farmers, and those engaged in animal husbandry, yes, we can expect this from all of them. But in that area, which tree is more suitable for drought in summer and cold weather in winter? So we need a mind, common sense and strategy to identify this, and we need to take action for this as well. This is one of the biggest shortcomings that we have for the whole region. And our most important observation is, as Murat mentioned, you're on Reşko and Cilo vineyards. So for 20,000 years, it has been a roof of glaciers, and now it's melting. Those melting water, is it enough for the soil? No, because when you go to Çukurca from Hakkari, when you go to Cilo area, for instance, the soil structure is changing and the grass structure is changing. So those melting water cannot be used for agriculture or for drinking water purposes. And also the flow of the river is also decreased. Of course, I'm not an expert in this respect. So I do not see any rights, for myself to say anything about this, but I think we definitely need to develop an energy system. If we fail to do this, we will no longer have any surface waters or ground waters, and in order to abstract more water, we will consume more energy. So when we say adaptation, of course, it's adaptation to soil. So what does the soil tell us? When should we plant, etc.? We should hear the soil. We should be adapting ourselves to soil. And also when it comes to energy consumption, we should give the least harm to the soil and the grass, and we should develop such an energy system. And also I produce in Hefsel garden as well, in the whole area. What's happening here? This is my physical home. So what's happening here? In the past, with recycled wastewater, we could be engaged in agriculture, but it's no longer the case. Very urgently, recycled water system should be built, because if this wastewater is not recycled and used for agriculture, we get it from elsewhere, Tigris, and then the fish varieties in Tigris is decreasing. So we abstract water, and also productivity is decreased, and then we need to use fertilizers, pesticides, etc. It goes back to that river, Tigris, and most probably in 15 years time in Tigris, we will not be able to observe any fish varieties. So what should we do with all those experiences? So first of all, our region, when it comes to sunlight, it's very generous. So God gave us plenty of sunlight. So for 8 to 9 months, we have sunlight. And the solar power system should urgently be constructed, and the energy obtained from the system should be transferred to agricultural activities. As you already mentioned, of course, individual activities are important. So when we are brushing our teeth, we should use less water. We should be paying more attention to this. Wastewater should be used for irrigating the gardens, etc. But the personal or individual activities have very tiny impact in terms of fixing the impacts of climate change. So we are a country of agriculture. We have plenty of lands, and individually and conventionally, we are planting those lands. So this is a country of agriculture, and we consume energy to this end. So as soon as possible, this solar power should be transferred for agricultural activities. And secondly, green areas. We are poor in terms of green areas. So starting with Urfa, up until Uludere, there are no trees. So tree is feeding the soil. It takes the humidity or moisture from the soil. It gives it back to the soil, and it regulates the temperature of the soil actually. So the soil here and the soil on the street, along the street is different. Although it's irrigated every day, it's different. So we should include those engaged in animal husbandry. We should convince them, and we should have afforestation in the area as soon as possible. We do it mostly for agriculture, and we should regulate this. How can we regulate this? So constructing dams on its own is not a solution. So it's like we are filling this with a glass, but we are abstracting buckets of water back. So we cannot solve the situation like this, and there's no productivity as well, and then we need to use fertilizers because we cannot have productivity. So water consumption is important. We should take actions immediately, bringing together all the communities. We should also have inspection, both legal arrangements and inspection, and we should work on that. And I think I'm finished with my time. This is enough.
Well, thank you very much, Adet. You said you were not an expert to this question, but let me correct you, because both in terms of the information you provided on the region and the topics you mentioned, you are an expert. And even more than that, if we talk about making the climate change become a social and community issue, we need to remember our starting point. Thank you very much for helping us on this. Space, city, valleys, plains, you have named them all. And as a lover of geography, I want to thank you. I will check all of them on my map. Now we have 15 minutes left. If you like, let us dedicate these 15 minutes to the online questions. Let me try to summarize these questions and give you each 2 minutes. Some questions are specifically addressed to certain panelists, but some questions can also be answered by any of you, however you would like to use your 2 minutes. Arzu Dinçer asked a question. She talks about the drought in eastern and southeastern Anatolia and the forests, and in the areas where there is no forests, the bush areas are important, and local governments' budgets that they dedicate to environments are important. And when we ask the mayors and municipalities, they show us their approach towards climate change and environment in terms of allocating budget to these issues. Well, let us further enhance her question by asking the level of cooperation and awareness on the local government side in terms of climate change. There's another question. I want to ask a question to Professor Özlem. Yes, we shouldn't expect all responsibilities to be shouldered by the administration and the government, but how us as citizens become resilient in terms of large structures such as hydroelectric power plants or all different structures that have an adverse effect in climate. So this is actually what we try to achieve in this program. I think this is an important question, and maybe we can all touch upon this issue. Abdulkadir Bozdemir asks that I like actually these types of questions in these events. The role and responsibility of civil society is questioned in his words. Many multinational actors, NGOs, are becoming silent when it comes to high governmental powers, and they are not opposing nuclear, for example, he says, and Abdulkadir says they demand action to be taken, but they cannot take a stance against these big powers. And isn't it the main problem we have, he says. Maybe we can consider this from the perspective of weaknesses of civil society. International NGOs' contributions and weaknesses can also be considered in this question. We can generalize it and formalize it as this condition. There are people who are really curious about Hevsel gardens and orchards. They want more answer. For example, planting corn, maize, does it mean diminishing the sources of Hevsel orchards? Let me also learn about the impact of lack of water. There's another question. Organic farming is proposed as a sustainable way forward. Let us get your opinions on this. Biodiversity is something else, of course, but organic farming is also something else. Do they have a cross-cutting role in terms of climate change or not? Maybe Doğanay and Murat can help us reply to this question. The farmers, the producers, awareness raising is questioned by Ekrem Can Aydın. In my field activities, I observe that they know farmers know very well the effects of climate change because they're experiencing it firsthand. And one participant asks if this could be a course in academy. In Ankara Bala district, in Balam, in Afshar Women's Cooperative, minimum carbon footprint and zero waste principle is used in local products production, she says, and she is giving us great contribution. And Figen's question is that cooperatives and local producers contribution in climate change adaptation can be considered when answering her question. And we have another question in terms of gender, Özlem. we mentioned that women are among the more vulnerable groups, and maybe we can focus on the reason for this. And ecofeminism comes to mind. Nefis Özulucan expresses this both as a method and as a world mentality. Ecofeminism, is it guiding us? Nefis asks. So these are the questions I wanted to pose to you collectively. So let us get your contributions. Not longer than 2 minutes, please. Let's start with Doğanay. Let me answer a couple of questions. One, in terms of local governments and climate change. Well, now Turkey's climate change adaptation action plan is being prepared, and the responsibility is on the local administrations, local governments. And in all municipalities, climate change and zero waste departments have been established. I am also involved in the preparation of this adaptation action plan, and then there is a problem, which is lack of personnel in the municipalities and lack of their awareness and knowledge level. At the municipalities, we still mix adaptation and mitigation. For example, we are planning a training activity for Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality staff. And in terms of action plans, let me say one more thing. At the provincial level, if we have climate change action plan, and if we put this on the responsibility of the metropolitan municipality, it's problematic because there is a jurisdiction of municipality. Forests are also sensitive towards climate change. And when you create adaptation action plan, the municipalities don't have jurisdiction in forest areas, for example. Another question about me, I can talk about organic farming. Well, organic farming, how organic is it? When we do not put any chemicals, we believe it's organic, but how correct is it? When we call something organic, it might not be organic, but what could save Turkey agriculturally, if you ask me? The first thing is we need to develop a crop pattern which is compliant with the regional specificities. You said our agricultural understanding has changed, but it's changing again. Actually, in 1990s, the agricultural understanding changed we were doing rain-fed agriculture, but with GAP project, we started irrigated agriculture. We started planting maize and alfalfa. We have diminished the rangeland and grasslands, but we started planting forage crops in our agricultural land, and we started irrigating that, and we needed to, of course, change our irrigation culture, and we are turning back to rain-fed farming once again. So it's not only organic farming, but we should talk about rain-fed agriculture in eastern and southeastern Anatolia. This is possible through planning, and of course there are some strategic products. Water and food is in the forefront, and of course we need to first have a self-sufficient country in terms of food crops, and the rest is detail, of course. No tillage farming, sustainable land management, and etc. These are all principles that we should develop afterwards. So with good practices, best practices, we should show the farmers how to do so, because our farmers do not implement something before they see it. We need best examples. Thank you very much. There's another question. Let me add it to the list. Metin says, I'm a journalist in Batman, and I also try to cover ecologic-based news, but activists, I think he speaks about environmental activists, they face problems in coming together, and they discuss too much when they come together. And of course, let me ask you, if you have these observations, do you observe any collaboration problems among the environmental activists? Maybe actually you would like to reply to this question. Well, Should I start with that question or ecofeminism? Well, let me start with, well, when we say administration and government, I didn't want to be misunderstood. Shouldn't we do anything as communities? That was a question, whether the communities should give up. Well, actually, the basic class in politics is organization. We need organization, we need to organize, establish new organizations and to support already existent organizations and somehow to be involved in the decisions made for the spaces that we live in. And this is not something we can achieve alone. And let me underline one more issue. We talk about climate crisis. We say crisis, and in terms of crisis, unfortunately, some organizations can open the path for solidarity, and also they can have some other concerns in their speech in terms of hate speech. For example, when there's a fire, who started the fire, it can lead to even racist and blaming discourses. So we need to help a fair discourse to be disseminated, and it's important for us to take part in this. Let me come to the question of ecofeminism. My approach is that women is nature friendly. We should learn everything from women. Rather than this type of an approach, when I included women among the vulnerable groups, I didn't mean that women are the only groups that are vulnerable, but well, actually, we talk about ethical values. How do we take care of air, water, soil? We are living in this era where everything turns into valuation. Everything turns into an investment instrument. But that soil, that water is important for our life, even beyond its monetary value. We need to consider this. Ecofeminism is important in this sense for a living being to live. What are the conditions we can consider in terms of taking care of these values is around ecofeminism. And when policies are being designed in this issue, this inequality in care labor is highlighted. And it gives us an important perspective in this regard. In terms of environmental organizations, the lack of collaboration is also one of my concerns. Doğanay mentioned that there are environmental organizations that are focused on conservation. And all of them to find a common language is very difficult, but it's necessary. What type of a framework are we going to create so that people should not feel that they're betraying their own perspectives, but they are going to start collaborating with each other's beliefs? Well, the environmental organizations call themselves the defenders of life. So some of them are blamed that they are non-political, but I believe that we should see it as an opportunity to create a policy level. Without giving themselves up, they are finding a common ground, and that is the important point, and we need to give up our egos to be able to do that.
Or we need to set aside the differences when the crisis is deeper. Yes. Over to you now, Mr. Murat. We are waiting for your contribution. Maybe I can remind you that there was a question about the cooperatives and also in terms of working together with the local governments as well. There was a question. I'm checking it. And again, about the opportunities and limits of the environmental action and organic farming. So a lot of agenda items for just 2 minutes. So can you tell me the first one once again? Organic farming and cooperatives. Yes, I also highlighted this, as you know. So suitable for the conditions of today, we should decrease affectability, increase resilience, and also correct adaptation should also be covered in agricultural and livestock production. And also agricultural lands and biodiversity should be harmed in the least way possible with the sustainable and eco-friendly agriculture. So we should believe in the possibility of this, the water unions, the irrigation unions should take action. We should disseminate it to the big agricultural lands. So I think this is one of the most important topics. As you know, correct farming and agroecology, I mean agricultural ecology is also important because every big plain or highland has different characteristics like water, the soil geomorphology, vegetative cover. So actually every single land is a different ecosystem, I mean agricultural ecosystem. Therefore, agroecology principles should be applied one by one in the orchards, of course. But first of all, the big plain areas, agricultural land should be prioritized with the support of local governments, municipalities, or there should be applications that are not contradictory with one another. For instance, Izmir Metropolitan Municipality has works carried out for agricultural purposes, so it should not have any contradiction with the other policies. It should have its own way. So the women organizations, producer unions, collectivism should also be included in this new type of organization. This is how it can be possible, because in an agricultural land or in an agricultural ecosystem, half of the orchards may use chemicals or poisons, for instance, or a lot of fertilizers. And if the weed, I mean, if they are taking actions against weed with chemical means, it is also having an impact on the other organic farming applications, and it's impossible to succeed in this like this. And secondly, we talked about Hakkari and its mountainous areas. So all the mountainous areas of Turkey, including southeastern part of Turkey and Cilo, when the roads are constructed there, first of all, the miners go there. In Hakkari, in Cilo Mountains, with the relatively ensured or provided peace, the new mining companies are always in search. The uplands that are fed by the glaciers, melting glaciers, and its animal husbandry, and the natural vegetative covers, etc., they are all harmed. And thirdly, the local, I mean, types of local organizations should be democratic, social, and attach importance to the public. And the environmental unions, the ecological unions, the associations, environmental platforms, ecological platforms that are established to this end should develop further, starting with local level. So a lot of associations have their areas of responsibility when they have a good ownership. But sometimes if they have an ownership about the responsibility of another association, it may be problematic. First of all, they should separate their areas of responsibility very clearly. Unfortunately, the majority of the local governments in Turkey, as mentioned before by Doğanay, is that they are considering this from the perspective of an election period, I mean, a short term. And if they do not think that they will be able to collect votes in the longer term or in the shorter term. I mean, by increasing the resilience, decreasing the vulnerability, and having the best practices and renewable energy sources, alternative water resources against drought, etc. So if they think such options will not make him collect votes in a short term, they do not prioritize and support such actions. And actually, they should all be eliminated. Therefore, the social organization and local civilian movements and associations and environmental platforms, what they are all doing is very important. Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Shahadat, lastly, I would like to give you the floor about Hefsel. People are very curious. So how agriculture can feed us in Turkey, and how can we ensure feeding with good agriculture is important. So for 8,000 years, there has been agriculture in that area. So Hefsel Gardens example is very important for us. That's why it's under UNESCO protection. I think the question is about the corn cultivation or maize cultivation. Actually, there are wrong agricultural practices there. So there's Tigris, for instance, it's a very wetland, and therefore there is maize or corn produced there. But mostly it's also green vegetables that are cultivated, and they require water continuously. I mean, such crops. So for 8,000 years, there is an ongoing tradition of Hefsel gardens. And in order for this tradition to go on further, actually, very urgently, we should have suitable options. We should use the river less and the groundwaters less. And what can we produce this way? So we have our agricultural habits. For instance, we have been cultivating tomatoes for 10 years, but it's wrong. Tomato requires or requests water every other day. We shouldn't cultivate tomatoes for this reason. So local governments, the NGOs and associations should come together and implement a new agricultural strategy. And about recycled water, recycled wastewater, it's totally a bureaucratic topic. So in order to do it better, the wastewater center was closed and it's reconstructed, and we're still waiting for this. So it's the issue here. And in the meantime, of course, we abstract water from the river. I mean, all the producers. So this is the situation. So can we have a smoother transition? Of course, we can have a smoother transition without interruptions and waiting further. However, bureaucracy is slow, just like all over Turkey. It's also the case in Hefsel, and it corresponds to 1 year of costs. And it's more than 1 year, actually. For more than 1 year, we haven't been using recycled wastewater. It's terrible. So we already have very scarce water, and we cannot use already existing. We are using the scarce water. Thank you. And I'd like to thank our participants as well, especially those asking questions in front of their screens. I would like to thank you. Actually, when we were answering questions, there were new questions, but at least I will summarize them very quickly. For instance, lately, it has been a very important environmental disaster, cyanide in the Euphrates River. And can city councils be active in terms of adaptation? That's another question. As far as I know, Istanbul City Council has a climate change committee which is working actively. So I can at least mention this. And regularly, they are distributing some important reports and brochures. And lastly, Tolga Zafer Çıkrıkçı asks why, rather than building on the ground, why are we not constructing the buildings under the ground so that we can protect ourselves from the adverse effects of the weather and nature, and we can have more comfortable living spaces maybe? Can I make a contribution about the city council, says Mr. Murat? Can I make a contribution about the city councils? Can we please increase the sound of Mr. Murat? I think he will make an addition. Yes. I have an experience about city councils. Can I make a contribution if you allow me, please? As you know, as per their nature, city councils have their regulation and bylaws and rules, but as per their nature, they are open, transparent, and loose structures, and both assemblies can be established, and also working groups can be established under them. So by creating like environmental assemblies under the city councils, and under those assemblies, including climate change, all the environment related issues like ecological ones, social ones, local culture, on a lot of different topics, working groups could be created. So this is my contribution. So this is actually an easy way to do it. So if people can come together and create a community with the same perspective, there can be city councils. Under that we can have environmental assemblies, and under that we can have different working groups to be created. And when that working group says something, in the long term it will also push the municipality to take an initiative on that particular topic. For instance, it can also create such an environment. Yes, I would like to thank you all once again. We will continue with the best practices panel in different places in Turkey regarding climate change and climate justice. There are groups with voices, and we will be hosting them in the upcoming panel. We would like to thank you all.